Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we are tackling a massive topic, one that essentially defines the geopolitical world you and I live in right now.
It really does.
We're looking at the aftermath of World War II, but, we aren't talking about the battles or the treaties today.
No, we're focusing on what happened after.
Exactly. The moment the smoke cleared and Europe realized it hadn't just been destroyed, it had been split into two completely different universes.
It's a fascinating pivot point in history. You go from a world united against a common enemy to a continent divided by what the historical sources call the bipolar order.
Right, the bipolar order. And it's not just a line on a map.
Not all. It's a collision between two fundamentally different ways of organizing human existence.
Political, economic, and social.
All of the above.
That's what struck me the most going through the source material for this deep dive because, we tend to think of the Cold War as just spies and nuclear standoffs.
Which it certainly was.
Right, it was. But the research emphasizes that the real battle was institutional.
It was.
It was a contest to see which system could actually function better.
And that brings us to our mission today. We're just going to unpack that contest for you. We need to look at how the U.S. and the USSR carved out these spheres of influence.
The specific institutions they built to lock them in place.
Yes, and ultimately why the historical data shows the Western model generating distinct prosperity while the Eastern model stagnated and collapsed.
And we have a lot to get through, from an absolute alphabet soup of economic agencies to some truly harrowing accounts of life under the Soviet sphere. We are pulling from historical analysis, economic data, and specific accounts of social unrest.
It's a comprehensive look.
So let's just start with the immediate aftermath. 1945, Europe is rubble.
Complete devastation.
And the United States is the last superpower standing with an actually functioning economy. How did they approach this? Because looking at the notes, it seems like a radical departure from American tradition.
Oh, it was a complete 180. You have to remember, for 150 years, the U.S. foreign policy motto was essentially George Washington's advice.
Steer clear of permanent alliances.
Exactly. But by 1947, the calculus had completely changed. The sources indicate they realized they couldn't just retreat across the Atlantic again.
Right.
They needed to integrate Western Europe into a system that could actively resist Soviet expansion.
And this brings us to the muscle of the operation, which is NATO.
The North Atlantic Treaty Organization.
Right. I think everyone knows it's a defense pact, but the context here is crucial. The text highlights that this wasn't just a club or a standard treaty.
No, it was a security guarantee backed directly by the U.S. nuclear arsenal.
That's the key right there. Article 5.
An attack on one is an attack on all.
Which effectively outsourced the national security of Western Europe to the United States.
It permanently tied them together. If you're France or the Netherlands, you don't have to worry about the Red Army rolling across your border tomorrow.
Because the U.S. is standing right there.
Exactly. That security umbrella is what allowed these shattered nations to stop worrying about sheer survival and actually start focusing on rebuilding.
But security is only half the equation, right? You can be safe and still be starving.
Very true.
This is where the economic strategy kicks in. And honestly, this is the part I find most interesting in the material.
The Marshall Plan.
Yes, the Marshall Plan. We always hear about it, but the details in our sources really highlight how sophisticated it was. It wasn't just, a giant bag of cash they handed over.
No, and that's a very common misconception. It was about $13 billion.
Which is a staggering amount in 1948 money.
Unimaginable, really.
Yeah.
But the way it was distributed mattered so much more than the actual dollar amount. The U.S. didn't just hand it over, they provided credits that had to be used to buy goods.
Often American goods, sure.
Right. But the massive catch was that European nations had to coordinate with each other to get it.
So they essentially forced integration.
They did. If France wanted steel for reconstruction, they had to talk to Germany.
Wow.
It forced these historic enemies to build an economic nervous system that actually connected them.
Which is brilliant when you think about it. It laid the absolute groundwork for the European Union later on.
It did. And it was bolstered by those other institutions we see mentioned in the text, the World Bank and the IMF.
The Bretton Woods system.
Precisely. The World Bank provided the loans for the heavy infrastructure, rebuilding the roads.
The bridges, the power grids.
Exactly. And the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, stabilized the currencies.
To keep trade flowing, it ensured that trade didn't just grind to a complete halt because one country's currency collapsed.
Right. And then you have just TT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade.
Which is the forerunner to the WTO. the World Trade Organization.
Yes,
Now, it sounds a bit dry to talk about tariffs and trade agreements,
it can.
but the source material argues this was actually the engine that prevented a World War III. By slashing tariffs and opening markets, the West created an environment where trade just absolutely exploded.
It's the concept of liberal interdependence.
Okay, unpack that a bit.
It's the idea that if we are trading partners and our economies are fundamentally linked, we are much less likely to shoot at each other.
Because it hurts your own bottom line.
Exactly. The result of this integration and liberalization was the economic miracle of the 1950s. Western Europe didn't just recover.
It boomed.
It thrived.
So on one side of the Iron Curtain, you have integration, open markets, and collective defense. Now let's pivot and look east, because the Soviet Union isn't blind.
No, they're watching all of this very closely.
They see the Marshall Plan happening. What's their play? Do they just sit back?
Well, their very first move was to forbid their satellite states from participating.
Right, because countries like Poland and Czechoslovakia were actually initially interested in Marshall Plan aid.
They desperately needed it.
Yeah.
But Stalin shut that down immediately. He saw Western economic integration as a direct threat to Soviet control.
So they needed a counter-response. And this is where we get what the sources call the mirror image institutions.
That's right. If the West had the Marshall Plan and the push for economic integration, the Soviets created Comecon.
The Council for Mutual Economic Assistance.
Yes, but the actual function was totally different from the Western model. While the Western system was designed to jumpstart recovery through open trade, Comecon was largely designed to bind the satellite economies tightly to the Soviet Union.
Looking at the data here, it reads a lot less like a partnership and much more like a resource extraction scheme.
In many ways, the historical consensus is that it was. The Soviet Union had been devastated by the war too, perhaps more than anyone else in terms of sheer infrastructure and human loss.
Absolutely.
So they used Comecon to prioritize their own reconstruction, often at the direct expense of the satellite states. They made them dependent.
And on the military front, they countered NATO,
With the Warsaw Pact in 1955.
which, again, looks like a standard defense alliance on paper. But looking at the command structure described in our deep dive materials, it seems much more about internal control.
That's a very fair assessment of the documents. The Warsaw Pact placed the military forces of the entire Eastern Bloc under the direct command of Moscow.
So it wasn't just about defending against a potential NATO attack.
No, it was about ensuring that the Soviet Union had the physical military capacity to keep these satellite countries in line. It ensured military dependency.
I want to spend some time digging into the economic model itself now, because this is where the divergence between the two spheres becomes really stark. We're talking about the planned economy.
The central planning model.
Right. I think most people understand the basic concept. The government owns the factories, the state controls production, but the sources go into the actual mechanics of why this system struggled so much compared to the market-driven West.
It really comes down to what economists call the allocation problem.
Okay.
In a market economy, millions of individual decisions naturally determine prices and production. If people suddenly want blue jeans, the price goes up, and companies automatically start making more blue jeans.
Because there's a profit incentive. It's automatic.
Exactly. But in the Soviet sphere, that decision is made by a committee.
A central committee.
Right. Central planners in Moscow had to sit down and decide exactly how many shoes, how many tractors, how many tons of steel to produce for the entire block for the next 5 years.
Which sounds impossible.
It largely was.
Yeah.
Now, the sources do point out a fascinating paradox here. The Soviet command economy was actually brilliantly effective at building heavy industry.
Right, because you can force that. You can just look at a map and say, build a massive steel mill right here.
And it gets built. They electrified vast regions. They built massive industrial bases from scratch. Stalin's 5-year plans were brutally effective at turning a largely peasant society into a global industrial power.
But the system was terrible at complexity.
It was. It completely failed at nuance.
It couldn't handle consumer needs.
Without price signals, the planners were flying blind. They might successfully meet the quota for producing shoes,
But they'd produce 1 million pairs of shoes in sizes that nobody actually wore.
or of a quality that fell apart in a week. Because the factory manager doesn't care if the shoes actually sell to a consumer. He only cares that he met the raw production target set by the planner in Moscow.
That distinction really comes through in the accounts of daily life in the East. The sources are careful to note the trade-offs. The state did provide the basics, guaranteed employment, universal education, housing, healthcare.
But the quality was often abysmal.
Exactly. It's the difference between having coverage on paper and actual quality of care. Yes, housing was heavily subsidized, but the notes described the new apartment blocks as shoddy and severely overcrowded.
You might wait 10 years on a list for an apartment. And when you finally got the keys, the plumbing might not even work.
Because the construction firm was rushing to meet a state deadline.
Not to satisfy a tenant.
There's a specific term used in the literature here, the shortage economy.
Yeah.
Meaning money wasn't necessarily the problem for regular people. Finding things to actually buy was the problem.
You might have a pocket full of cash, but the store shelves were empty. Or you had to wait in line for 6 hours just to buy a basic loaf of bread.
It created this persistent, grinding frustration.
A frustration that slowly ate away at the fundamental legitimacy of the entire system.
But frustration is one thing. Waiting in line for shoes is one thing. The human cost of enforcing this ideology goes much, much darker. We have to talk about the agricultural policies, specifically collectivization.
This is where the ideological plan collided with reality in a truly horrific way.
This is one of the darkest chapters we cover. Let's look at the case study of Ukrainian collectivization.
Right. The Soviet leadership, particularly under Stalin, viewed independent farmers as a political and economic threat.
The kulaks.
Yes. They wanted to rapidly industrialize agriculture to feed the growing cities. So they aggressively forced peasants to give up their private land and their livestock and join massive state-run farms.
And looking at the historical accounts from Ukraine, the resistance was intense.
Naturally, these were people whose families had farmed that specific land for generations. They absolutely did not want to become mere employees of the state.
So they resisted. The sources say sometimes by literally burning their own crops.
Or slaughtering their own livestock rather than handing them over to the state authorities.
And the state's response was ruthless. They didn't just arrest the dissenters. They weaponized food.
They did.
The details on the Holodomor, the terror famine, are incredibly difficult to process. The sources detail how the state essentially blacklisted entire regions from food distribution. They went in with armed units and confiscated not just the harvest, but the seed grain for the following year.
Leaving them with absolutely nothing to plant. It was a state-engineered, man-made famine.
The sources cite approximately 5 million deaths.
5 million.
It's a number so huge it's hard to wrap your mind around. The historical notes describe whole villages just going completely silent.
And it is crucial to understand, this wasn't a crop failure due to bad weather or drought. This was a deliberate policy choice.
The analysis shows it demonstrates that in this specific system, strict ideological adherence was prioritized over human life itself.
Sticking to the plan mattered more than the people.
It really underlines the immense brutality required to maintain this kind of state control, and that control eventually extended to physically keeping people inside the system.
Which brings us to the Berlin Wall.
The ultimate symbol of the Cold War. But the motivation behind building it is what I find so telling when reading these sources. It wasn't a military barrier built to keep an invading NATO army out.
Yeah.
It was built because the East was hemorrhaging its own people.
It was a brain drain of massive proportions.
Yeah.
By the early 1960s, professionals living in East Berlin could literally just look across the street to West Berlin and see that economic miracle we talked about earlier.
The doctors, the engineers, the skilled workers.
They saw better pay, better consumer goods, and actual political freedom. So they just walked across the border and left.
Thousands were leaving every single day.
The East German economy was on the sheer verge of total collapse because of this exodus. So in 1961, the regime made a desperate calculation.
They built the wall.
They did. It stabilized their economy by physically stopping the exodus, but it was an absolute PR disaster on the global stage.
It was a massive admission of failure.
Exactly. It proved that the communist system simply couldn't compete on its own merits. They had to trap their citizens inside.
Now, moving forward in the timeline, Stalin eventually dies in 1953, and we enter a period that historians call the Thaw. Nikita Khrushchev takes power in the Soviet Union, and reading about his secret speech in 1956, it sounds like there was a genuine moment where things might have fundamentally changed.
There was real hope for reform.
Yeah.
This is the period of de-Stalinization. Khrushchev officially denounced Stalin's crimes and the cult of personality.
He implemented some tangible changes, right?
He did. He scaled back the absolute terror of the secret police networks. He instituted a 40-hour work week. He even tried to shift some economic focus away from heavy industry and toward consumer goods.
Trying to fix that persistent shortage problem we discussed.
Exactly. But the sources highlight that there was a hard limit to this thaw. A severe economic recession between 1953 and 1964 seriously undermined these reforms. And more importantly, Khrushchev was absolutely not willing to give up the Communist Party's total monopoly on power.
And that central contradiction, wanting a freer society but maintaining total authoritarian control, exploded in the satellite states.
It did.
We see this clearly in the two major revolts covered in the source material: Hungary in 1956 and Czechoslovakia in 1968.
These are crucial turning points. In Hungary in '56, you had a reformist leader, Imre Nagy. He was swept up by immense popular demand. People were literally in the streets demanding free elections.
And then Nagy went a step too far for Moscow. He demanded that Hungary exit the Warsaw Pact.
He declared neutrality. He wanted out of the Soviet sphere of influence entirely.
And that was the ultimate red line.
Moscow sent in the tanks. The accounts show 3,000 Hungarians died fighting the Soviet army in the streets of Budapest. Nagy was arrested and eventually executed. The regime was completely hardened.
It sent a very clear message. You can maybe tweak the economic system slightly, but you cannot leave the bloc.
Never.
And then 12 years later, you have the Prague Spring in Czechoslovakia. But this felt a bit different. Alexander Dubček wasn't trying to leave the Warsaw Pact, was he?
No, he wasn't. His stated goal was what he famously called socialism with a human face.
Right.
He wanted to end state censorship, allow real freedom of speech, and democratize the inner workings of the party. He truly believed he could save communism by making it freer.
But the result was exactly the same as Hungary.
The result was exactly the same. The Brezhnev Doctrine was in full effect by then.
Explain the Brezhnev Doctrine for us.
It was the formal Soviet policy stating that Moscow had the right to intervene militarily in any socialist country to protect socialism. So Warsaw Pact troops invaded Prague, Dubček was arrested, and all of the democratic reforms were instantly rolled back.
So for decades, the lesson to the Eastern Bloc was incredibly clear. Any attempt at real liberalization or reform leads directly to tanks in the streets.
Crushed militarily every single time.
But then we jump ahead to the 1980s, and suddenly the whole thing just unravels. Now, we know the economy was stagnating for years, but why did it finally collapse then? What was the catalyst?
It's a combination of that long-term institutional rot and a very sudden shift at the very top. By the 1980s, the economic gap between East and West was simply undeniable.
The West was entering the high-tech information age.
And the Soviet bloc was still struggling to produce decent quality shoes and basic consumer goods. Plus, the sheer military cost of maintaining this massive empire was quietly bankrupting Moscow.
Enter Mikhail Gorbachev.
Gorbachev is the ultimate catalyst here. He took power and recognized that the system was fundamentally dying. He introduced glasnost, which means openness, and perestroika, which means restructuring.
He wanted to modernize the economy and allow for open public criticism to root out corruption.
Right. He was trying to save the system by reforming it. But the critical decision, the absolute turning point that ended the Cold War, was a shift he made regarding foreign policy.
1989.
It is arguably the most important year in the second half of the 20th century. Gorbachev officially announced that the Soviet Union would no longer use military force to intervene in the satellite states.
He repudiated the Brezhnev Doctrine.
He jokingly called it the Sinatra Doctrine to the press, meaning those countries could now do things their way.
He took the tanks off the table.
He did.
That is just wild, because if you think about the implication of that, for 40 years, the only thing keeping the unpopular governments in Poland or Hungary or East Germany in power was the implicit threat of a Soviet military invasion.
Precisely. The domestic legitimacy of those regimes was essentially zero. They ruled entirely by fear. So once Gorbachev officially removed that fear, the dominoes fell with incredible speed.
Without the threat of tanks like in 56 and 68, peaceful revolutions just swept the entire bloc.
In Poland, you had the Solidarity movement winning actual free elections. In Hungary, they officially transitioned to a democracy in 1990 and literally opened their physical border to Austria.
And then the Berlin Wall.
A fall of the wall happened almost by accident. A botched press conference by an East German official led to massive crowds swarming the border checkpoints. But because of Gorbachev's new doctrine, the guards didn't shoot.
The people just surged through, and the Iron Curtain evaporated.
It did. And the failure of these economic reforms, combined with a massive surge of nationalism across the republics, led to the final collapse.
By 1991, the Soviet Union itself is entirely dismantled.
It dissolved in December 1991. The bipolar order that had rigidly defined the entire world since 1945 was completely over.
It's such a massive historical arc to trace. We started with a Europe divided by fear and ideology.
One side betting on integration, liberal markets and collective defense. The other on central command, military dependency, and force control.
And the history gives us a very clear verdict on which system works. The Western model, even with all of its inherent flaws, created a system that was adaptable. It could handle complexity.
While the Soviet model, being incredibly rigid and authoritarian, simply couldn't survive the transition into the modern world. It broke under its own weight.
It really emphasizes for you that institutions matter. Those boring acronyms we listed, NATO, IMF, WTO, they weren't just dry bureaucracy.
No, they were the actual framework that allowed peace and unprecedented prosperity to take root in the West.
Absolutely.
And, if there is one single image to leave the listener with today, building on all this source material, I'd actually go back to the Berlin Wall. It's the ultimate litmus test for any society. As the text noted, the wall wasn't built to keep enemies out. It was built because people were desperately fleeing to the more prosperous West. It was built to keep citizens in.
Right.
It raises a profound question for you to consider. If a political and economic system requires a massive physical barrier, armed guards, and a literal death strip just to prevent its own people from escaping, hasn't that system already died long before it officially collapses?
That is a deeply powerful thought. If you have to lock the doors to keep the family inside, it's not much of a home.
Exactly. The political collapse of 1989 was really just the physical reality finally catching up to the moral and economic bankruptcy that had been there all along.
Well, that is a heavy but very necessary place to leave it. It's a complex history, but understanding the split explains so much about the geopolitical map we still look at today.
It certainly does. Thank you for walking through the data with me.
Always a pleasure. We'll catch you on the next deep dive.